Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Stand By the technically band Heldon.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Okay, chop, there's no time to waste. There is really not a lot of favorite bits from this album, seeing as this is not a very long album at all, so here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So, did I ever tell you that I'm a sucker for album covers? Well, I am. It doesn't matter how many times I do this, I always see a good cover before listening to the actual music, thinking to myself that, a good cover has to be equal to good music. And while this album's cover did make me very hyped towards listening to it, I think that there was one thing that also contributed to my hype towards this album, and that had to be its subclassification of prog, being of course electronic prog. This subgenre of progressive rock is one that I don't often see, and it's seldom really mentioned in any type of conversation that revolves around prog. And when I saw that this album was electronic prog for the first time on the Prog Archives, I kind of just sat there not knowing what to do with myself, because I entirely forgot that it was even a subgenre of progressive rock. But I quickly came to my senses and realized, ooh, this is gonna be something very much special, and I was waiting for this, but unfortunately it didn't really turn out to be what I expected it to. So today's album is Stand By Heldon, which is technically a band, but it's technically just one person, and it's an alias for the person known as Richard Venus. Now I don't know if his name is Venus because it's actually, written as Penis, and I really don't want to say that, so I'm gonna say Venus for the rest of this video. And Richard is a French multi-instrumentalist who embraced electronic music somewhere in the 70s, and around it revolved his own band Heldon, in which they created progressive music, which also happens to be very electronic. And while Richard is on this album technically the only official band member, he is joined by a few other players which have been with him since the start, notably being Patrick Gauthier on the Moogs and the piano and Francois Auger on the percussions. And together with a bunch of other people, they set out to create Heldon's last album in the 70s, coming out in 1979. This is Stand By, but this would also go on to prove to be their last album ever. Technically, they released another one in 2001, but we're not gonna talk about that. But then afterwards they disbanded, which is kind of funny seeing as they disbanded just before the turn of the decade, which of course turned to be one of the most strong electronic decades of all time, the 80s. Now, it isn't a shock to anyone hearing that this electronic prog group came out of France, seeing as France was always the leading nation in this type of music, and they still are, with amazing bands that came later on, such as Daft Punk, which have their own unique sense of electronic house music. And Richard Venus and Heldon as a whole were probably one of the pioneers in that regard entirely, and they started doing their thing in 1974, and they gradually became more and more popular until of course the release of their last album in 1979. Now of course, me reviewing these albums on a daily basis, I always seek some good sort of refreshment, and I was really hoping for some with this album. And while it did bring much new to the table, it kind of didn't act as the refreshment I was hoping for it. This album unfortunately turned out to be an album most notable by its repetition and monotony. Now the thing is, this album opens up with a side long track, almost a 22-minute long track called Bolero. Now despite the classical name, there is not a lot of classical influences that I could find on this one, and again, as I said, there was just a lot of repetition, which was nice at first, but then when it kind of surpassed the 2-minute mark and nothing really changed, it gets boring real quick. Honestly, personally, listening to this first track on this album, I really couldn't see what consists of being progressive rock over here. It just didn't feel like anything progressive was going on. The long runtime, well, that's fine. People have been doing really long songs, since forever, so it doesn't have to mean that it's progressive rock, and I really didn't find a lot of things progressive about Heldon's music right here. Now, I would love to have elaborated more on this piece because it's a huge piece and it's definitely monumental for this album, but honestly, there's really not a lot I can say, and I'm not inclined to go ahead and re-listen to it right now. And then we flip the record and we're in side B. Now, this one doesn't have one piece on it, but it does have two of them, with one being a shorter one and one being a definite longer one. Now, the shorter one is called Un don de journée. I have no idea what it means. I was too lazy to even go and translate that, so I'm just gonna, I'm gonna guess that it means the goal of the journey. And I know there's some of you who know French, so you're gonna correct me on that for sure. And this piece, despite being short, is just kind of continues what Bolero did, and it doesn't really make anything new. It just is electronic synths, arpeggios, and it's all very repetitive, and you kind of forget about it very quickly. Of course, when I'm saying stuff like this about monotony and repetitive, I don't mean that there's just one constant beat for like, half an hour. But the thing is, it really does feel like it when you're trying to think about it in hindsight. There's really not a lot of memorable moments on here, and that's quite unfortunate. But fortunately, it does change a bit with the last track on this album also being the title track for this one, called Stand By. This one kind of took me by surprise, and honestly, while I don't think that it's anywhere close to perfect, it is definitely a song that I find myself inclined to go ahead back and listen to for a few more times. This title track has two things going for it. The first one, of course, being that it's just more vibrant, there's more shifting and changing. The moods don't really change that much, but the melodical ideas are definitely there, and they're present, and they're constantly going in and out and doing different things. But if there's one thing which I really liked about this one, is actually the inclusion of real instruments in the spotlight. So far it has mostly been very technological and electronic with a lot of synths, but now we actually get some really good, guitar parts and percussion parts, and you even have that deep bass in the end of the song, which honestly makes me want to go ahead and listen to it again just to get to that end and enjoy that deep bass playing. So as a whole, this album was definitely providing me with some very interesting experiences. I really don't know what to say about it. It definitely wasn't a bad album, but it wasn't as good as I was expecting it to be. But I'm seeing right now that the last piece, the third piece on this album, the title track, is definitely starting to grow on me a bit. But for now, it is going not to redeem this album at all, and it's just gonna stay a pretty good album, and that's about it. Now let's move on to talking about this amazing cover. Fuck me, this is a great cover. I don't know if anyone would agree with me on this, but I really love this one. It is basically an 80s cover made back in the 70s, and it completely gripped me and made me want to listen to this album all the more. Forget composition, color balance, imagery, whatever, just looking at this cover really made me feel like something strong, something personal, something otherworldly and deep, and nothing that I would really expect from a prog album at all. And this kind of, exotic feeling that I got from it was definitely something much appreciated. Now, I am well aware that this cover isn't really something that special, and you find these types of covers anywhere in 80s club albums, but to me, this just really looks good, and the aesthetic on it is just marvelous, and I really like its use of colors, imagery, whatever, as a matter of fact, and I do believe that it does match the music on here quite well, even if I'm not the biggest fan of Heldon's music from Stand By. And when looking at this cover and looking at the cover of their previous album called Interface, I really can't help myself to think that Daft Punk probably had some influence when they tried creating their own characters, and which they looked, of course, at these two covers in Heldon's performance and were inspired by it at least a little. So currently, unfortunately, this album helps to render this subgenre of electronic prog as something lesser in my opinion when compared to the other progressive rock subgenres, and this album will get a very definite rating of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Saint Ruddy Guns by the band Spirogura. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallum, Rist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.